For most of us, marriage is this deeply personal thing. But in the eyes of the law, it's a status. And that one little word, status, can determine your entire financial future. Today, we're digging into what happens when that legal status gets messy and how the interpretation of a single word, wife, has completely changed over time in Indian law with some absolutely life-altering results. I want you to think about this for a second. What if you went through a marriage ceremony, lived with someone for years, built a life, only to have a court tell you that legally none of it was real, that your marriage was never valid? Are you just left with nothing? This isn't just some crazy what-if scenario. For a lot of people, this is a painful legal battle that's been raging for decades. So here's our roadmap. We're going to start with a quick legal timeline. Then we'll break down some really critical definitions you need to know. After that, we'll look at a controversial precedent from 2003 and see how the Supreme Court recently turned it completely on its head. And finally, we'll talk about why this whole legal shift matters so much in the real world. Okay, let's set the stage. Our story really begins with the one law that governs Hindu marriages in India. It all kicked off with the Hindu Marriage Acts back in 1955. But the real drama, the part we're focused on, centers on two huge moments. A super strict ruling in 2003, and then, much more recently, a landmark Supreme Court case that changed everything. This isn't just a list of dates. It's the story of a massive shift in how the law thinks. All right, before we get into the court cases, we have to get our heads around two legal terms. And trust me, understanding the difference between these two is absolutely essential to grasping the entire conflict. Okay, on the one hand, you have void marriages. The easiest way to think about these is that they were never legal to begin with. They're void from day one. The classic example is bigamy. Someone is already married. And the key takeaway here is that the law says these two people never had the legal status of husband and wife. Now, on the other hand, you have voidable marriages. These are different. They're actually considered valid until a court steps in and cancels the whole thing, maybe because of fraud or force. In this situation, the couple did have the status of husband and wife, at least for a while. This distinction, as you're about to see, is everything. Next up, let's talk about the money. There are two kinds of financial support. First, there's interim maintenance. Think of this as temporary support. Basically, enough cash to keep the lights on and pay the lawyers while the case is still going on. But the real prize, the one this entire legal battle is about, is permanent alimony. This is the long-term financial support that's decided at the very end. The big question has always been, who gets to claim it? With those definitions clear, let's hop in a time machine and go back to 2003. A ruling came down from the Bombay High Court that would set the tone for more than 20 years. The court's logic in that case was, well, brutally simple. They said, if a marriage is void, it never legally existed. If it never existed, the woman was never a legal wife, and if she was never a wife, she gets no permanent alimony. End of story. For over 2 decades, that was the law, plain and simple. But it wasn't just the ruling that was harsh, it was the language. The judgment used some truly shocking and frankly derogatory terms, like illegitimate wife and even faithful mistress to describe these women. What's really telling is that the court didn't have any of these colorful adjectives for the husbands in the exact same situation, which really pointed to a gender bias that would later get put under a microscope. So this incredibly strict precedent stood for over 20 years. But the fight was far from over, and eventually this whole debate landed on the doorstep of the highest court in the country. And that brings us to the main event, the case of Sukhdev Singh versus Sukhbir Kaur. The Supreme Court was finally asked to settle this once and for all. Does a woman in a marriage that was never legally real have any right to financial support? The answer was about to change everything. What came out of the Supreme Court wasn't just a small correction. It was a whole new way of looking at the law, one built on ideas like dignity, fairness, and the real-world fact that one person might be financially dependent on another. And here it is, the complete reversal. The Supreme Court said, flat out, that even if a marriage is declared void, a spouse is still entitled to seek permanent alimony. This was a seismic shift. We went from not entitled to entitled to seek. Huge difference. But, and this is a really important but, the court said this isn't an automatic right. It's what they call discretionary relief.
This gives judges the power to look at the details of each unique case. How much does each person make? What was their conduct like? Was the woman tricked into the marriage, or did she know the situation from the start? It allows for real justice, not just a rigid, one-size-fits-all rule.
And the Supreme Court didn't stop there. They went back and powerfully condemned the language used in that 2003 case. They called terms like illegitimate wife misogynistic and said that using them violates a woman's fundamental right to a life with dignity, which is guaranteed right there in the Indian Constitution. So this wasn't just a legal fix, it was a moral statement. This table really just lays it all out, doesn't it? The then versus now is so stark. Before, you had to be a legally wedded wife. Now, any spouse from a void marriage can at least make their case. The whole focus has shifted from your rigid legal status to the realities of your financial situation and your conduct. It went from an automatic no to a flexible, justice-focused maybe.
So we've traced the legal journey, which is fascinating. But what does all this legal back and forth actually mean for real people?
Well, for women, especially those who were duped into a fake marriage, it's a potential lifeline. It gives them a path to financial security and affirms their right to dignity. For judges, it gives them the tools to deliver actual justice instead of being handcuffed by technicalities. And for lawyers, it completely changes the game. It's not just about proving a marriage was valid anymore. It's about showing the real-life circumstances of the people involved.
So what's the big takeaway here? The law has fundamentally moved from asking a very narrow question, were you legally a wife, to a much more human one, do you deserve protection? And that really leaves us with a final thought to chew on. When the law decides to protect a person's dignity over a rigid definition, who benefits the most? Maybe the answer isn't just one group of people, but our whole idea of what justice should be.